4 minutes over Germany, February 23, 1944, 25,000 feet above occupied Germany. The outside temperature was minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. At that altitude, exposed skin froze in seconds, breath crystallized instantly, hydraulic lines stiffened, metal turned brown. Thickened up here, the sky was not blue, it was white with high winter haze, white with contrails, white with smoke from exploding flak. Inside the cockpit of a battered B-17 flying fortress named Yankee Doodle, 23-year-old Lieutenant John Morgan adjusted his oxygen mask and checked his instruments for the 5th time in 2 minutes. Altitude steady, airspeed holding at 182 miles per hour. Engines 1 through 4 within him. Stretching as far as the eye could see, nearly 300 American bombers held tight formation, an aluminum armada, a city in the sky. They were heading toward one of the most heavily defended targets in southern Germany, the Messerschmitt aircraft factory near Regensburg. The plant built the deadly Bf-109 fighters that had been tearing through Allied formations for years. Destroy the factory and you slow the Luftwaffe. Miss the factory and the war continues longer. Morgan understood that. He also understood something else. The deeper you flew into Germany in early 1944, the lower your odds of coming home. Thorpe Abbott 0600 hours. The mission had begun before sunrise at RAF Thorpe Abbott's in eastern England. The men had been shaken awake at 400 hours. Powdered eggs burnt coffee silence. When the curtain was pulled back during briefing and the red yarn stretched deep into southern Germany, no one needed to say anything. Regensburg, deep penetration, long fly, heavy flak, maximum fighter response. Morgan had studied the map carefully. 90 miles inside enemy territory before reaching the target. 90 miles in, 90 miles out. That was a long way to limp home if something went wrong. The crew of Yankee Doodle AB-17 was not a plane. It was 10 lives welded together. Morgan's crew, co-pilot Lieutenant James Chin, California navigator Lieutenant Robert Walsh, Massachusetts Bombardier Staff Sergeant David Clean, New York Flight Engineer Technical Sergeant Frank Russo, Pennsylvania Radio Operator Staff Sergeant William Hayes, Texas Ball Turret Gunner Sergeant Michael O'Brien, Illinois Waist Gunners Sergeant Thomas Rivera, Arizona and Sergeant Charles Anderson, Michigan Tail Gunner Sergeant Henry Jackson, Georgia. They had flown 15 missions together, 15 times through flak, 15 times through fighters, 15 times watching other bombers fall. Today was number 16. Only 9 more missions stood between them and a completed combat tour if they survived. Crossing into Germany 0943 hours. The formation crossed the Rhine at precisely 0943 hours. The intercom crackled. Bandits possible. Stay sharp. Morgan's gloved hand tightened around the control column. At this altitude, control surfaces were sluggish. Every movement required strength. You didn't fly a B-17, you wrestled. The sky ahead looked empty. It never stayed that way. 0957 hours, bandits. 11 o'clock high. Jackson's voice from the tail. And then they came, sleek, fast, deadly, Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighters diving out of the sun. Their cannons flashed tracer rounds, streaked like burning comets. The entire formation seemed to vibrate as 20mm shells ripped through aluminum. Morgan felt the bombers shudder. The top turret erupted behind him as Russo fired. The smell of cordite filled the cockpit. Brass casings bounced off the floor and rolled under Morgan's boots. The first pass lasted seconds, then the fighters were on. Damage check one by one, the crew called in. Waist okay, bolt turret, good, tail good, minor hits, nothing catastrophic. They had been lucky. Luck did not last long over Germany. 1,012 hours, the second wave. This time the attack was coordinated. Messerschmitt Bf-19 fighters joined the assault. Head-on pass is the most dangerous of all. Closing speeds over 400 miles per hour. Morgan Hill said bombers had one job on approach: stay level, stay tight, no evasive maneuvering. If he broke formation, he endangered every aircraft around him. He watched a B-17 off his left wing take a direct cannon hit. Engine number 3 exploded. The bomber rolled. 3 parachutes blossomed. 7 men did not get out. Morgan forced himself not to look. You could not fly and mourn at the same time. 10-18 hours impact. ABF-19 came straight at them, head on. Cannons firing continuously. The nose of Yankee Doodle exploded inward. Plexiglass shattered. Metal screamed. David Clean, the bombardier, was killed instantly. Walsh, the navigator, collapsed seconds later. Shell fragments tore through the cockpit floor. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across Morgan's instruments. Warning lights flared. Engine number 2 ignited. Then engine number 1 began pouring smoke. Both engines on the left wing were compromised. The bomber immediately dropped out of formation, altitude beating, fire spreading, hydraulics on, pressures head, chin shot. Morgan didn't answer. He already knew they were 90 miles inside Germany. The bomber was dying. Protocol was simple: ring bailout bells, save yourself, save whoever can jump, but the intercom was damaged. Some of the crew might not even know how bad it was. If Morgan jumped immediately, the aircraft would roll into a spin. Anyone still inside would be trapped by heavy forces. He looked at Chin. No words needed. Get them out, Morgan said. I'll hold her steady. Chin hesitated only a moment. Then he unbuckled and disappeared into the fuselage. Morgan was alone in a burning aircraft. The 4 minutes the left wing was becoming an inferno. Flames crawled toward the fuel tanks. The aircraft wanted to roll left violently. Morgan fought the controls with everything he had. His gloves were slick with hydraulic fluid. His oxygen mask fogged with sweat. The bomber lost 500 feet per minute. If the nose dropped too far, they would dive uncontrollably. 60 seconds, he glanced back. Rivera and Anderson were on board. 90 seconds. Fire reached the main fuel cells. Metal peeled away. The wing structure was visible through flame. 2 minutes, altitude 19,000 feet. Chin appeared briefly. They're moving. Count to 20 before you jump, Morgan said. Make sure they're clear. 3 minutes. The wing spark glowed red. Morgan could feel the flexing. He counted in his head. Every second bought another life. 3 minutes, 30 seconds. The spark snapped to sound like a rifle shot. The left wing folded upward at 45 degrees. Craft lurched violently. Morgan held the control column with both arms, bracing his boots against the floor. 3 minutes, 45 seconds. The bomber entered a spin. It was over. Morgan released the controls, unbuckled, grabbed his chute. The centrifugal force pinned him sideways. He fought toward the hatch. 4 minutes, he jumped. Behind him, Yankee Doodle disintegrated midair. Morgan pulled the ripcord. The chute snapped open. Silence. He counted parachutes. 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, 8, 9. All 9 men had escaped except Clean and Walsh. Morgan had kept his promise. Morgan drifted downward through freezing silence. The roar of engines was on. The thunder of cannon fire had vanished. All that remained was wind, and the distant sound of something burning as pieces of Yankee Doodle fell through the Bavarian sky. Below him, Germany looked peaceful. Fields stitched together like a quilt. Dark forests, narrow roads, farmhouses with thin lines of chimney smoke rising into cold morning air. It looked nothing like war. That was one of the strangest things about aerial combat. Up there, chaos, done and quiet. Morgan adjusted his descent slightly, pulling on the risers. He needed to avoid open ground. A field meant visibility. Visibility meant capture. He scanned the horizon. Smoke marked the crash site several miles to the north. Search parties would already be mobilizing. German doctrine was efficient. Civil defense units, police detachments, Hitler Youth auxiliaries, local farmers armed with hunting rifles. The Reich offered rewards for captured Allied airmen, money, extra ration cars, recognition. Every civilian was a potential hunter. Morgan hit the ground hard. The snow cushioned some of the impact, but the frozen earth beneath it did not forgive. He rolled, just as survival training had taught him. Never stay still after landing, never let the chute drag you. He gathered the white silk quickly. Parachutes were beautiful in the sky. On the ground, they were beacons. He stuffed it into a drainage ditch along the field's edge, covered it with snow and dead grass, and forced himself to breathe slowly. Adrenaline was still flooding his body. He wanted to run, but running without direction was death. He checked his watch. 10:47 hours, 7 hours until sunset, 7 hours to stay in his survival kit. Every American airman carried one. Morgan removed the small pouch from inside his jacket. Inside, a silk escape map of Europe printed with rail lines, rivers, and borders. A button compass, high-calorie chocolate bars, water purification tablets, German Reichsmarks, a small hacksaw blade sewn into the heel of his boot. Benzodrine tablets for forced wakefulness if needed. He unfolded the map carefully. Regensburg was marked. He estimated his position. Approximately 15 miles northeast of the city. The Swiss border lay nearly 180 miles to the south. Neutral Switzerland. It might as well have been another planet. He folded the map and slid it back inside his jacket. Rule 1, move only at night. Rule 2, avoid civilians. Rule 3, never use roads. Rule 4, ration food. Morgan moved toward a small forest half a mile away. Open ground was vulnerability. Trees were each step in snow made noise. Each noise felt like an alarm bell. The forest, the tree line swallowed him. The temperature hovered just above freezing. Snow clung to branches. Wind moved gently through the canopy. Morgan found a hollow beneath a fallen oak tree. It wasn't comfortable, it wasn't warm, but it was invisible. He crawled inside, pulled his collar up, and waited. Waiting was harder than flying through flak. In combat you reacted. On the ground you endured. He allowed himself one square of chocolate. The sugar hit his bloodstream like fuel. Temporary strength, temporary illusion. Time passed slowly. He forced himself to stay awake. Falling asleep in cold could mean never waking up. He whispered German phrases under his breath. Ich bin amerikanischer Soldat. I am an American soldier. Kriegsgefangener. Prisoner of war. He hoped he wouldn't need him. 13:30 hours. Voices close. Very close. German voice. Morgan froze. Through small gaps between exposed roots, he saw movement. Field gray uniforms, rifles slung over shoulders, a searchline, methodical, systematic 8 soldiers, one carrying an MP40. They were combing the forest carefully. He caught fragments of conversation. Bomber crew bored. They were motivated. One soldier stopped directly in front of the fallen tree. Morgan stopped breathing. The soldier lit a cigarette. Smoke drifted lazily. Ash fell on snow. Morgan's heart pounded so violently he was certain it could be heard. Seconds felt like hours. Then the soldier flicked the cigarette into the snow and moved on. The patrol disappeared deeper into the forest. Morgan waited another full hour before moving. Fear had weight. It pressed against the ribs. It tightened the throat. But fear was useful. It sharpened decision-making. He could not stay here. He needed distance. But another thought began to take shape. His crew, he had counted 9 parachutes, 9 men alive. Sumner scattered alone. He could head south immediately, increase his odds. But leadership did not end when the aircraft disintegrated. He had been their aircraft commander in the sky. He was still their commander on the ground. He made a decision. One night he would search for survivors for one night. If he found no one by dawn, he would move towards Switzerland alone. It was a calculated risk and it was personal. Nightfall, the sun dipped below the horizon at 17:30. The forest darkened. Snow reflected faint moonlight. Morgan began moving carefully, step by step. Every 50 meters he stopped. 3 short whistles, pauses, and the risk was obvious. German patrols could hear, but silence guaranteed separation. At 21:15 hours he heard it. 3 short whistles northeast. His heart surged. He moved cautiously. Another whistle. Closer. A shadow stepped from behind a tree. Was Chicopa alive? They didn't embrace dramatically. They simply stood there, relief visible even in darkness. I saw Russo and Hayes land west, Chin whispered. Lost sight after that, then we find them. Morgan replied. They moved together now. 2 shadows in a hostile forest. Hours passed. At 22:45, they found Russo and Hayes hiding in an abandoned barn. Cold, shaken, alive. At 1:30, they located O'Brien and Jackson near a frozen creek. 6 men accounted for. Rivera, Anderson, still missing. Morgan gathered them quietly. We're 90 miles inside Germany, he said. Switzerland is south. A week minimum. We need clothes, food, shelter. Stay together. Hayes asked. Safer apart. Russo muttered. Morgan shook his head. Separate, we're easy to capture. Together we have a chance. No one argued. No one left. They chose him again. Dawn, February 24th, they found an abandoned hunting lodge deep in the woods. Broken windows, but shelter. They posted sentries in 2-hour shifts. Chocolate bars were running low. Real food would soon become necessary, and food meant risk. That afternoon, disaster came quietly. Jackson spotted movement. German patrol, 6 and too close. He whistled the alarm. The Americans scrambled through back windows. Gunfire erupted. Snow exploded around Morgan's boots. They scattered. Forest swallowed him. Morgan dove behind a fallen log. Voices shouted in German, more gunfire, then silence. He waited. Footsteps passed. Then he heard something that cut deeper than gunfire. Chin's voice, we surrender. Morgan closed his eyes. He could not save them. No, attacking would mean death for all. He stayed and he counted. 4 voices captured Chin. So, O'Brien. He moved slowly afterward. He found Jackson shaking beneath a bush. Ouch, Jackson whispered. Captured 2 men left out of 10, 2 dead. 4 captured. 2 earlier, now 2 fugitives. The long walk south for 3 days. Morgan and Jackson moved through Bavaria. They stole civilian clothes from a farmhouse clothesline. They took potatoes from a root cellar. They avoided roads, avoided town. People. They walked nearly 30 miles, feet blistered, hunger constant, exhaustion layered upon exhaustion. On February 27th at dawn, they crossed an open field. They misjudged the light. A farmer saw them, shouted. Police arrived quickly. There was no resistance, no weapons, no strength left. Morgan gave name, rank, serial number, nothing more. He and Jackson were transported to a Luftwaffe holding facility. Inside were dozens of Allied airmen. British, Canal, hollow-eyed, all waiting. An officer interviewed Morgan. You remained at the controls, the officer said calmly. Morgan's stomach tightened. How do you know? Your crew speaks highly of you. Silence. You will be transferred to Stalag Luft 3. Morgan nodded. The war in the sky was over. The war in captivity had begun. Captivity Stalag Luft 3 was built specifically for Allied Air Force officers. Located in Sagan, then Germany. Designed to prevent escape. Deep sand beneath barracks, seismographs to detect tunneling, guard towers, barbed wire searchlights. Morgan would spend 15 months there. He survived starvation, rations, brutal winters, interrogations. He survived the forced evacuation in January 1945 when prisoners were marched west ahead of Soviet advance. 90 miles on foot, blizzard conditions, men collapsing beside roads. He survived. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. Morgan weighed 115 pounds. He had lost 60 pounds. But he was alive. The meaning of 4 minutes. Morgan later learned the fate of his crew. Clean and Walsh had died in the initial attack. The rest survived captivity. All came home. 9 lives saved in 4 minutes. But to understand what that meant, we must step back. Because Morgan's story was not unique. It was part of something larger. The relentless, grinding, statistical brutality of bomber warfare in 1944. The arithmetic of survival when Lieutenant John Morgan stepped off the transport plane back in England in May of 1945. He was alive. But statistically, he should not have been. To understand that statement, to truly understand it, we have to widen the frame. Morgan was not simply a pilot. He was part of the largest aerial bombing campaign in human history. And in 1944, that campaign reached its most violent phase. The 8th Air Force, the men who flew missions over Germany, belonged to the 8th Air Force. Activated in 1942, based in England, its purpose was direct and uncompromising, destroy the industrial heart of Nazi Germany through daylight precision bombing. Factories, rail yards, oil refineries, aircraft assembly plants, ball bearing works, synthetic fuel production. Every machine that kept the Wehrmacht moving was a target. By early 1944, the 8th Air Force had grown into a floating industrial machine of its own. More than 200,000 personnel, thousands of aircraft, entire English counties reshaped by airfields, runways carved out of farmland, Quonset huts lined with mud, control towers rising above hedgerows. At peak strength, a single mission could send more than 1,000 bombers into German airspace. Each bomber carried 10 men. That meant 10,000 lives in the sky on one day. And every one of those lives existed inside thin aluminum skin. The aircraft, a fortress and named the backbone of the campaign, was the B-17 Flying Fortress. It was called a Flying Fortress for a reason. 13.50 caliber machine guns, 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines, armor plating around key positions, self-sealing fuel tanks. A bomb load of up to 8,000 pounds. At cruising altitude 25,000 feet, it was above most early war fighter capabilities. But by 1944, German fighter design had evolved. The B-17 was durable, it was not invincible. Aluminum can only absorb so much violence, and violence was constant. The mathematics of mortality, the required combat tour in 1944 was 25 missions. Complete 25 missions and you went home. That was the promise. It sounded manageable. 25 flights, 25 days in the sky. But that promise ignored statistics. In early 1943, loss rates over Germany could reach 5% per mission. 5% might not sound catastrophic until you apply compound probability. If you faced a 5% chance of being shot down on each mission, the probability of surviving 25 missions without being killed, wounded, or captured was less than 30%. In certain months, survival odds dropped even further. Only about 35% of B-17 airmen completed their full tour intact. That means nearly 2 out of every 3 men who climbed into a bomber did not finish unscathed. They were killed, they were wounded, or they were taken prisoner. The sky over Germany was not merely contested, it was lethal. October 14th, 1943, to understand the fear that followed cruise into 1944, we must look at one date. October 14th, 1943, the second Schweinfurt raid, the target ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt, Germany. Ball bearings were critical for every moving machine in the German war economy. If you stopped production, you crippled tanks, trucks, aircraft. The mission launched 291 B-17s. They did not yet have long-range fighter escorts deep into Germany. The result was catastrophic. 60 bombers failed return. 60 out of 291. That was more than 600 men lost in a single day, killed, missing, captured. The loss rate approached 20%, 1 in 5 aircraft gone. The mission was so devastating that deep penetration raids were temporarily halted until long-range escorts, primarily the B-51 Mustang, could accompany bombers all the way to targets. Men who survived Schweinfurt carried that memory forward. Every briefing afterward carried its shadow. Morgan had heard those stories before his 16th mission. Everyone had flak. The unseen enemy fighter attacks were terrifying, but flak was relentless. German 88mm anti-aircraft guns could fire shells to precise altitudes. Timed fuses exploded the shells into cloud of razor-sharp shrapnel. Black puffs filled the sky. Each puff represented hundreds of steel fragments moving faster than sound. Pilots could not evade. Bombers had to fly straight and level during bomb runs. Turning meant missed targets. Missed targets meant wasted missions, so they flew through it straight level, unlinking. Flak did not need to destroy an aircraft to kill it. One fragment through an oil line, one through a hydraulic system, one through a pilot, and a fortress became a coffin. The cold at 25,000 feet, temperatures routinely dropped below minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the bomber, insulation was minimal. Waist gunners operated with open windows. Their gloves froze to metal. Breath crystallized on oxygen masks. Frostbite was common. Men lost fingers, some lost toes. Oxygen deprivation was equally dangerous. The thin air meant constant dependence on oxygen systems. If a line froze or ruptured, a crewman could lose consciousness silently. Hypoxia was insidious. You felt lightheaded, then euphoric, then confused, then unconscious. Some men removed masks because they felt fine. Minutes later, they would add the positions and their odds. Not every seat in a B-17 carried equal risk. Bombardiers sat in the nose. They suffered some of the highest casualty rates. Fully exposed during head-on fighter attacks, navigators beset them. Tail gunners were isolated in alone, small compartment, minimal protection. If the tail was hit hard, escape was nearly impossible. Ball turret gunners occupied the most feared position, encased in a glass and metal sphere beneath the fuselage. They had to rotate the turret to exit. If landing gear malfunctioned, they could be crushed during landing. If the aircraft lost power and went into a spin, centrifugal force pinned them inside. The image of the ball turret gunner became immortalized in Randall Jarrell's poem, The Death of the Ball Turret Gunner, 5 lines long, brutal in simplicity. When I died, they washed me out of the turret with a hose. Poetry captured what statistics only hinted at. Training was no safer before combat. There was training. Training killed 8,000 American airmen before they ever reached Europe. Mechanical failure, other mid-air collisions during formation practice, takeoff crashes. The B-17 demanded precision. There was no margin for complacency. The ritual of a mission by 1944. Every bomber crew knew the ritual. 0400 wake up, silence in the mess hall. 0500 briefing curtains pulled red yarn across maps. Intelligence officers outlining flak concentrations. Chaplain offering prayer. Many men wrote letters before takeoff. Letters mailed only if they did not return. 0630 bus to aircraft. Ground crews suiting engines, coughing blue smoke into morning air. 4 engines per bomber. 300 bombers meant 1,200 engines roaring simultaneously. The sound shook the earth. 0730 takeoff at 30-second intervals. One mistake could cause chain collisions. Formation assembly took nearly an hour. Pilots navigated visually. Radio silence maintained. 0830 formation complete. The channel below. France had 0900 German radar contact. Fighters scrambled. The waiting began. Every man scanned the horizon. Every man aware that today might be the last time he saw England. Why they kept flying with those odds, with that fear. Why did they continue? The answer was rarely ideology, rarely abstract patriotism. The answer was simpler. The men beside you inside a B-17, 10 men depended on each other completely. If a gunner froze, fighters got closer. If an engineer faltered, engines failed. If a navigator IR day, the formation drifted. If a pilot panicked, everyone died. Trust became oxygen. Morgan did not hold the controls for 4 minutes because he was fearless. He held them because those men were not statistics. They were Rivera from Arizona, Chin from California, Jackson from Georgia. They were brothers forged by repetition of danger, shared breakfast, shared laughter, shared funerals. The turning point, 1944. By early 1944, something shifted. Long-range escort fighters now accompanied bombers deep into Germany. The P-51 Mustang changed the balance. German fighters could no longer attack freely. Loss rates began to decrease slightly, but not enough to remove fear. Every mission still meant risk. Every mission still meant counting empty bunks afterward. Morgan's 16th mission occurred during this transitional period. Fighter escort was present, but not everywhere, and not always at the critical moment. The Luftwaffe still fought ferociously. A culture of acceptance among bomber crews, a quiet understanding developed. You did not speak openly about fear. You did not calculate odds aloud. You flew the mission in front of you. You celebrated small milestones, 10 missions complete. Each painted bomb symbol on the fuselage was a mark of defiance against probability. Some men carried lucky charms, coin photos, religious medals. Some developed rituals, touching the same rivet before takeoff, stepping into the aircraft with the same foot first. It wasn't superstition. It was control in a world where control was fragile. Survivor's burden. When Morgan returned home and received the Distinguished Flying Cross, he felt nothing. That was calm. Medals recognized actions. They did not erase memory. They did not silence nightmares. Men returned home physically intact but emotionally altered. They startled at loud noises. They avoided crowds. They rarely spoke about missions because explaining 25,000 feet over Germany to someone who had never left Kansas felt impossible. The larger cost, the 8th Air Force alone suffered more than 47,000 casualties, 26,000 killed, 21,000 captured. Nearly a quarter of all personnel became casualties. No other branch of American forces in Europe suffered proportional losses that high. Strategic bombing helped cripple German industry. It paved the way for decades. It shortened the war. But it demanded a price measured in aluminum fragments and parachutes drifting through winter skies. And so we return when John Morgan held Yankee Doodle level for 4 minutes. He was participating in a culture that had already accepted sacrifice as routine. He was one thread in a vast tapestry of calculated risk. His decision was extraordinary. But it was born inside an environment where ordinary men made extraordinary choices daily. And that is what makes his story powerful, not because it was unique, but because it was representative. The mind under fire at 25,000 feet above Germany, there is no room for philosophy, no room for hesitation, only reaction. When Lieutenant John Morgan took the controls after his co-pilot was shot, he did not consult courage. He acted. To understand why, we have to look inside the human brain under extreme stress. The moment the bullet hits, the human stress response activates in milliseconds. The amygdala, the brain's alarm system, detects danger before conscious thought forms. Adrenaline floods the bloodstream, heart rate spikes, peripheral vision narrows, time distorts. Many airmen later describe combat as happening in slow motion, not because time changed, because perception did. In Morgan's case, the cockpit filled with blood and noise. Wind roared through shattered plexiglass. Flak burst cracked against aluminum skin. His co-pilot collapsed. And yet Morgan did not freeze. Why? Because training overrides panic. Repetition creates neurological pathways that bypass paralysis. Take the controls, stabilize the aircraft, maintain formation, drop the bombs. The brain, under extreme stress, defaults to what it knows best. The 8th Air Force drilled that knowledge relentlessly. Leadership in a vacuum. Morgan was 23 years old. 23. An age when most young men are still searching for direction. He was commanding a $300,000 aircraft and 9 other lives. Leadership in bomber crews was not theoretical, it was immediate. When the pilot panicked, everyone felt it. When the pilot stayed calm, fear became manageable. Calm is contagious, so is terror. In cockpit voice accounts from the era, surviving crew members often described their pilot's voice in detail. Steady, flat, normal. Even when engines were failing, the voice became an anchor. Morgan's crew later testified that he never raised his tone. Not when the aircraft commander was mortally wounded, not when blood pooled at his boots. That emotional regulation saved lives. Brotherhood at 25,000 feet. Bomber crews did not choose each other. They were assembled during training and expected to function as a unit almost immediately. But something unique happened in heavy bomber groups. Isolation accelerated bonding. 10 and 1 aircraft. No escape once airborne. They ate together, flew together, wrote letters home in the same barracks, watched empty bunks multiply, shared cigarettes before missions, shared silence after the bunk. Family more than friendship. Research after the war revealed something surprising. Most airmen said they did not fly primarily for country. They flew for crew. They flew because quitting meant abandoning the 9 men who trusted them. Morgan did not hold Yankee Doodle steady for abstract victory. He held it steady because Rivera in the waist and Jackson in the tail were counting on it. That intimacy changes behavior. Fear without collapse. Contrary to Hollywood myth, bomber crews were not fearless. They were afraid constantly. Letters home reveal it. Hands shaking before takeoff, men vomiting quietly beside aircraft wheels, nervous humor masking dread. But fear is not weakness, fear is information. The difference is whether fear paralyzes or sharpens. By 1944, veteran crews developed coping mechanisms. Dark humor, superstitions, ritualized routines, emotional compartmentalization. They joked about flak happy hours. They named missions sarcastically. They turned terror into irony, because if you can laugh at death, it loses some power. When the sky goes silent after landing from a brutal mission, there was a ritual. Crews counted aircraft, eyes scanned the horizon. You learned to recognize silhouettes. That one always flew slightly low. That one had patched wings. When a formation gap remained empty, no announcement was needed. Everyone understood. The mess hall that evening would have fewer voices. Empty bunks became psychological wounds. Survivor's guilt began accumulating long before the war ended. Why him, why not me? Morgan later admitted in interviews that receiving the Medal of Honor felt uncomfortable. Others had died performing equally brave acts. They simply had not survived to be nominated. Recognition can isolate as much as it honors. Captivity and aftermath. Many bomber crews did not die when shot down. They parachuted into enemy territory. If captured, they became prisoners of war. Stalag Luft camps held thousands of American airmen. Hunger, cold, and terror. Uncertainty. Even those who survived captivity returned changed. Hypervigilance persisted. Sleep became fragile. Sudden noises triggered combat memory. Today we call it PTSD. After World War II, there was no name. Men were expected to reintegrate silently, find work, start families, say little, and most did. Morgan returned to civilian life, married, worked, built a family, but like many bomber veterans, he rarely spoke in detail about missions until decades later. Trauma delayed is not trauma erased. The psychological weight of command. There is another dimension rarely discussed: responsibility. When you are pilot in command, every loss feels personal. If another aircraft in your formation is shot down, you question decisions, altitude, choice, formation, spacing, timing. Even when events are beyond control, the mind searches for causation. Morgan carried that weight quietly because leadership does not end when the engine shut down. It lingers in memory. The brain after war. Modern neuroscience helps explain what these men experienced. Repeated exposure to life-threatening stress rewires neural pathways. The amygdala becomes hyper-responsive. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational regulation, struggles to dampen alarm signals. Sleep disturbances occur because the brain remains on guard, even in safety. Many veterans of the 8th Air Force reported recurring dreams of flak bursts and falling aircraft well into old age. Memory does not fade linearly. It resurfaces unexpectedly. Smell of fuel, sound of thunder, cold winter air. Triggers are subtle. Courage reconsidered. We often misunderstand courage. We imagine absence of fear, but real courage is action despite fear. Morgan's 4 minutes at the controls were not fearless. They were disciplined. Courage under fire is rarely dramatic in the moment. It is procedural. Check instruments, maintain heading, stabilize, drop payload, return home. The heroism is often quiet, almost mechanical. Only later does its magnitude become visible. The long arc of meaning. As decades passed, bomber veterans gathered for reunions. They stood beneath restored aircraft, ran hands along riveted aluminum, spoke names of friends lost in 1943 and 1944. They were young men frozen in memory while the survivors aged. When Morgan finally told his story publicly, he did so not to glorify war, but to honor crew, to remind younger generations that history is not abstract. It is human, it is fragile. The sky they left behind today, only a handful of airworthy B-17 Flying Fortress aircraft remain. When one flies overhead at an air show, the sound is unmistakable. 4 radial engines rumbling in imperfect harmony. For most spectators, it is nostalgia. For veterans, it was memory made audible. The smell of oil, the vibration through the fuselage, the cold waiting, the fear, and the brotherhood. Final reflection. John Morgan survived 25 missions. Many did not survive. On statistics, probability, but stories tell us meaning. And meaning is why we remember. Because inside every aluminum bomber crossing the North Sea in 1944 were 10 beating hearts, 10 families waiting at home, 10 young men balancing fear and duty. Morgan's story is not extraordinary because it